there is a difference between feeling stressed and having a stressful thought. There is a space in between there. You can stop a stressful thought and go make your mind go in a different direction. You just have to learn how to do it. And that's the value of thought awareness training or meditation, if you want to call it that. But that to me is the thing. You have to understand that stress comes from thinking, and thinking is thoughts that are produced by the mind, and the mind will produce the thoughts without your permission, or it can either serve you or it can be your master.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We have an exciting show today. Our guest is Thomas M. Sterner. He's the founder and CEO of the Practicing Mind Institute. He's an expert in present moment functioning who works with high-performance individuals, including athletes, industry groups, and individuals, helping them to operate effectively with high-stress situations so they can break through new levels of mastery. He's a musician, a composer, a recording and audio engineer. He's an athlete and an author. And he recently released the follow-up to his best-selling book, The Practicing Mind, with his latest book, Fully Engaged, Using the Practicing Mind in Daily Life. I'm happy to have him on the show. Tom, welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved with the work that you do and led you to eventually write the books that you've written.
Well, what got me into the realm of present moment functioning is that I was not very good at it when I was younger. When I was growing up, I was very creative minded, and my mind was very rabbit brained. It was running all over the place. And it's interesting because there was the observer aspect of my mind was always there, which is really what saved me, because that part of me was always watching this other part that seemed to be in control. And the part that was in control would have all these ideas of, I think I want to learn to play the piano. And then I'd, start lessons. And a month later, I'd be like, I really don't like practicing. And then I'd start making excuses, and then I would quit. But I still really wanted to play the piano. And eventually I did get back to it. But this was a cycle that I went through over and over again. And I guess it was around my senior year in high school where I really began to realize that if I ever wanted to accomplish anything that was important to me, that I was going to have to overcome this personality trait. And when I got into, I made that decision, and I had an understanding with myself that I was going to have to do that, but I didn't have any idea where to start, because I didn't understand why I was like that. And then I guess it was my freshman year at the University of Delaware. A friend of mine was taking a Religions of the World course, philosophy course, and he gave me his textbook. And I started reading on Eastern thought, which was the first time I'd ever been exposed to that. And I became fascinated with this whole Zen mind concept and a lot of the Eastern thought ideas. And that launched kind of a really hard study of those thought systems, which I began to apply to my life and how I processed things. And I was amazed at how it changed what I was accomplishing. I mean, I really became absorbed in the process of what I was accomplishing, and much less attached to the moment where I actually realized whatever the goal was. And then that propelled me into studying sports psychology, because I had gotten into golf. I didn't play when I was younger, and I wanted to, because I was getting into it late, I wanted to play as well as I could. And I was very fascinated with all the sports I was in: gymnastics, diving, golf. They were always singular sports where it was just you, and you were on a team, but you really were the individual that was responsible for your performance. So I liked that, and I became fascinated with the sports psychology, and I started studying peak performance and everything that was going on in that industry. And it became very apparent to me that they were just two sides of the same coin, that the Western studies were basically proving through empirical science what Eastern thought had said for centuries. And that is that when we're operating in the present moment, when we're very process oriented, we're functioning at our highest level. And I have said this many times, it's when we accomplish the most in the least amount of time with the least amount of effort. And the experience, our interpretation of the experience, is one of contentment and peace and calmness. So at that point, I wanted to share that with what I'd learned. And I also should say briefly that I was a concert piano technician for about 30 years. And in that time, I spent daily hours with some of the highest performers in the world, classical pianists, everything from jazz pianists to classical country. I sat in dressing rooms talking to them, sat in trailers at rock concerts talking to these people. And we had all these conversations about discipline and art and how they applied it and what they had learned. So all of that went into the practicing mind. And when I finished the practicing mind and put it out there, I just had no idea the impact it was going to have. And people began asking me for more. And after 4.5 years, I decided I had enough information to write a follow-up, and that's where Fully Engaged came from.
Awesome. Well, and one of the things I really appreciate about the book, and being a yoga and meditation teacher myself, is when I'm reading something or talking to someone who may or may not have any direct link to yoga, but they talk the same way that a yogi talks, and that's something like I noticed instantly reading your book is that the language that you use sounds like something that a yogi would say, but you're doing it without using the terminology of yoga. That is to say, it's a very accessible explanation of these things without any particular thing attached to them, whether it's a religious idea or a concept of, because if you say yoga, people have a very set thing in their mind of what that is. You don't ever make any of those statements, but it's clear that it was influenced by Eastern thought, and you incorporate a lot of these ideas, which I really appreciate and like.
What's interesting about that is, and that comes from, I guess, growing up in the West, so I started out on the other side. But what's interesting about that is that when the practicing mind when I was approached by a Japanese publishing company, they wanted to translate the practicing mind into Japanese. And when they did that, the publishing company said, the reason we feel that this book is going to be a big success in this country is that the concepts in the book are the foundation of what our country was built on. And everybody has lost that, and they want to get back to it. But the problem is that we've become so westernized that we can't relate to the Eastern thought. So they said, what we're looking for is the ideas to be taught through a Western perspective. And so it was just kind of an amusing situation, I thought.
Yeah, well, that's the Westerner going back to the East to help the East connect to the East through the Western concepts of the East, or something like that. Absolutely. So, so much of the work that you do is working with people to help them be more focused and more present in their lives. And I know one of the things you talk about that prevents us from that is stress. In your thought, what causes stress, and how can people start to move away from stress, or even to say, why are they so stressed today more so than other times in perhaps our human history?
Well, one of the reasons is because our thought, the amount of thinking that our mind does is ramped up today. I mean, everything is moving so quickly, and the media, with all the smartphones and tablets and computers and television, the media has a constant connection to us, and they're always trying to make us feel incomplete and that we need to be someplace other than where we are. And they can do that because they have this constant connection to us. So our minds are always being stimulated. And the other thing is, I've asked people, if you didn't think, could you experience stress? And the answer is no, because thought is the vehicle that carries the stressful emotions. You have a stressful thought, and that translates into the experience and internal feeling of this emotion, which makes you uncomfortable. And I think that when people say, how do I stop feeling stressed? Well, the first thing you have to do is separate yourself from the stress. And that sounds like, well, how do you do that? Well, you have to have an awareness. You talked about meditation. You have to have an awareness of what your mind is doing all day, because it's a thought machine. It's basically a problem solver. And if you don't give it a problem to solve, it'll go out looking for one. This day in sports psychology, they call this, going out into search mode. And it's always looking to visit something, to analyze something, to figure something out, to solve something. And for the most part, we go through our day just in our thoughts. We're not separate from our thoughts. We're just in our thoughts, experiencing whatever emotion is the result of the thought that our mind is producing in that moment. And when people say, well, I'm impatient, how do I stop that? Well, you have to understand, the first thing you have to be able to do is understanding the difference of feeling impatient and being aware that you're impatient. They're two different things. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is what thought awareness training does. And that's just a label, thought awareness training. There's meditation is another label for it. That process can be used for many things. It can be used as a stress reducer. Some people use it in their religious practices, but it is not tied directly to religious practice. So, just like some people exercise to lose weight, but some people exercise because it's fun. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it. But when you do sit down and work at quieting your mind, it doesn't take a whole lot of time for this context of what we're talking about here to become more aware of your thoughts, 10, 15 minutes a day. And you either sit quietly and observe what your mind is doing, focus on following your breath or saying a very short mantra. For my purposes, it doesn't really matter what the mantra is. It shouldn't be real long, but maybe 2 or 3 words. What happens is you very quickly realize that even when you will your mind to do something specific, it resists and doesn't like it. And it starts to it's very clever. It looks for ways of deceiving you and moving off into another direction. And it's very important for people to understand that this is how their mind works, because most of the time they're not aware of it. And when you begin to become aware of that, to circle back, that's when you begin to realize that there is a difference between feeling stressed and having a stressful thought. There is a space in between there. You can stop a stressful thought and make your mind go in a different direction. You just have to learn how to do it. And that's the value of thought awareness training, or meditation, if you want to call it that. But that, to me, there's the thing. You have to understand that stress comes from thinking, and thinking is thoughts that are produced by the mind, and the mind will produce the thoughts without your permission, or it can either serve you or it can be your master. And you have to learn that and understand it. And this has been proved out through a lot of Western documentation, and it's also been known in the East for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Well, in many schools of yoga, the principal cause of suffering, and some of the more traditional schools like the Samkhya philosophy and things like Patanjali that people are familiar with the Yoga Sutras, we suffer because we're mired in illusion that the world we're in doesn't exist. But in a lot of schools of yoga, where suffering comes from is actually misidentification. So it's saying that, well, we're connected to this great grand source, but we suffer because of essentially our thoughts about the world. We think that, okay, well, I'm over here and someone's over there. I'm tall or I'm short. I'm big or I'm small. I have this color eyes or I don't, or I have this color. And so we get caught up in this misidentification, and that's what causes suffering. And I think kind of what you're talking about as well, of course, fits into that, where our mind is thinking, well, I am sad, I am happy, instead of this is a sad thought or this is a happy thought. Since we have that identification, that's what causes so much of the stress. It's like, when you're stuck in a jungle and you can't see very far because there's vegetation everywhere, you've got to get up and have some perspective to see where you are to actually be able to navigate. And that takes that observance of like, okay, I'm having these thoughts instead of I am my thoughts. And that's such a huge shift, absolutely, I think, for people. You write about in your book about the opportunity to push past thresholds, and I really love kind of the solution for this, because it's something that I'm a very big advocate as well. You talk about the necessity of practicing being in difficult situations. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more to our listeners and talk about the necessity of like not just practicing under easy situations, but actually deliberately putting yourself in more difficult or stressful situations as practice.
Yes, when you feel yourself experiencing stress, meaning this situation is stress. So let's just take a job interview, for example, and you feel lack of confidence, and you feel just the overall stress and anxiety, nervousness of the situation. What that is, that's a very natural response telling you that you are in the process of mastering the process of interviewing in that particular case. When the things that you do that are effortless are things that you have already mastered. And so, for example, there was a time when walking across the room was a stressful ordeal because you were learning to master walking. Eventually you master it. Now you don't think about it. Expressing yourself linguistically, articulating yourself used to be something that was stressful because you couldn't do it. You had these thoughts that you wanted to express, but you couldn't say the words. You didn't know the words. We could go on and on, learning how to read, etc. They're all things, they're learning processes, and learning to deal with stressful situations is no different. So to me, the first thing that you need to do is change the perspective, because the situation is just the situation. It isn't stressful or not stressful. It's the interpretation of the situation that makes it, the experience of it, stressful. So when you can change your perspective and realize that I'm in a process of mastering this, it's normal to feel the way that I do, and these feelings are not an indication that I lack ability. They're an indication that I'm in this learning process. And when you can see that, your experience and your performance in the moment change, because the judgment stops. Because there's always this judgment of when you're in these situations. I should be doing better. You have all these rules that you start to place on yourself. And going back to what you said initially is that you can't learn to be good at interviewing if you don't go through job interviews. You have to be in that situation. So, in the book, I talked about the girl that was wanting to win this golf tournament, and she had a problem with when she was playing well. She played very well, but when something got in the way mentally and she started to falter, everything started to implode, and she wanted to learn how to overcome that. So we had a lot of meetings and we talked, and eventually I ended up in a tournament with her where this exact situation that she had trained for was happening. But up until then, it had not. And so she was in the situation and she wasn't doing well. And I asked her, how do you overcome this? And she said, I don't know. I've tried all this stuff. And I said, no, you have to be in this situation. If you want to learn how to play in the rain, it has to be raining. You can't sit on the range on a warm summer evening when the sun's setting and hit balls and practice playing well in the rain. So that's why, to me, when you find yourself in these situations that can be stressful, you should welcome those situations, because the reason they feel the way they do, the reason you're experiencing them the way that you do, is because you're in a state of learning how to master that situation. It's not a bad thing. It's an opportunity. And when you can see it that way, it really completely changes your experience in the moment, and also your performance, your ability to perform in the moment.
When you're talking about performance, and I want to bring up another topic that it's something I know that you talk about and describe in your book, and it's something that our culture tends to put quite a lot of praise on this idea of multitasking. If we can multitask and do lots of things, then we can get more done, and therefore it's more efficient. But the research is really starting to paint a very different picture about multitasking, or perhaps more aptly put, the fact that there is no multitasking. So I know it's something you talk about. I was wondering if we could get your opinion on that, as well as what is multitasking, or to say, do we actually multitask? Does it work?
No, there's really no such thing as multitasking. There's a book out by a guy named Dave Crenshaw called The Myth of Multitasking. It's been out for years. He compiled a bunch of research on it, and what they call it now is switch tasking, because what happens when what we perceive as multitasking is actually the brain stopping and starting. It just happens so quickly that we perceive it as multitasking. And there's a very interesting test that he talks about in there, and that is, he takes a sentence, and the sentence that he uses is multitasking is worse than a lie. And he says, what you do is you start a timer and you write multitasking is worse than a lie. But instead of just writing the sentence out, you number the letters. So you write the letter M, and then underneath of it, you write the number 1, and then the letter U, and then under that, the number 2, and so forth, all the way across until you finish the sentence. So now you've got the sentence written, and underneath of it, you've got each letter numbered. And you time that. And then after that, and I've used this with clients, it's really kind of it's almost like a parlor trick. Then you go back and you start the timer again, and you just write the sentence. And it could be any sentence. You just write multitasking is worse than a lie, and then you go back and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 until you've numbered all the letters. And what you find when you do this is that it takes about 35 to 50%, depending on the person, less time when you just write the sentence and then write the numbers underneath of it. And that's because when the brain, I should say, is doing the task separately like that, where it doesn't have to switch back and forth between letters, numbers, the performance goes way up. And so they found that this type of, when people are doing things during the day on their computer and talking on the phone and looking at different things, when they feel like they think they're doing multiple things, but what's really happening is they're asking their brain to stop and start thousands and thousands of times. And the fatigue factor that comes from this is incredible. And the performance output drop is also very incredible. It's like 25 to 35% performance drop. So I think that where we're headed in the culture is this idea of multitasking, to me, really has its roots in greed. I mean, you have the corporations that are trying to get more work out of less employees because that means higher profits. But what they're finding is that that whole thing is a misnomer. It's a myth. It doesn't work. And if they want to get more out of the employees need to be more process oriented, more present moment oriented, and also working at one thing at a time. On the surface, it looks like it would slow things down, but the data's in that shows that it's actually quite the opposite.
Well, and you talk a lot about anticipation as well, and how it can sabotage us in life. You have a practice in your book. I don't know if you actually call it this, but I call it the and then what practice. Can you describe a little bit of that for our listeners, and kind of how that relates to those moments when you are creating expectations or anticipating things in life, and how that can prevent us from being more present and focused in the moment?
Yes, I think that we're all imbued with this feeling of being incomplete. And, as I said, the marketing industry seizes that to make us feel like, well, yes, you are incomplete and life is passing you by and you need this car, this whatever it is, this thing, that thing, you need to acquire this, or you need to be making this much money, or whatever it is. And then that feeling will go away, because that feeling is a part of who we are. It's in our DNA. And I think that we misinterpret the purpose of that feeling. The purpose of that feeling is to make us stretch more, to grow more, to want to expand as a being. And we misinterpret the feeling as a feeling of being incomplete. Now, one of the things that happens with that is we feel like wherever I am, right here and right now, I can't be happy. I have to get to this other place. This other place is whatever the thing I need to acquire, whatever the goal is that I need to accomplish, whatever that is, I need to get there. And that immediately puts us in a position where we're here, that's there, and everything in between us is this struggle that we have to go through. And it's just all wrong. I think that if we can stop for a moment there and then ask ourselves, when we're having that experience, we say, and then what? If you can visualize yourself in the future at that moment in time when you've crossed the finish line, where you've acquired this, you bought the car, you've done whatever it is, and say to yourself, and then what? How am I going to feel when that happens? Am I going to feel like my life is complete? I'm fully realized. There's never going to be a sense of longing again. When you begin to do that, you start to realize that this is a cycle that we repeat over and over again. We've done it from the time we're children. There was always the toy we needed, the outfit we needed, the smartphone we needed. And we end up getting this stuff, and it doesn't change how we feel internally. And so when you begin to teach yourself this and really have it as a knowing, a conscious knowing that this cycle does not produce contentment, and then you can let go of this moment when you actually have this thing out there and realize that the reason anything feels good, any goal that is accomplished, anything that's acquired feels good, is it's the process of achieving it. That's why it feels so good, is that you've gone through this process. And if you can learn this, then you can turn your focus on the process and learn to enjoy every minute of the day instead of feeling like I can't be happy with where I am right now.
And that's very similar to the two we could say are the main threads within yoga, which is one is a very vertical path. It's more destination based. It's like until you get to that spot of enlightenment, you're not there, and everything's about seeking that, and you're suffering until you get there. But there's also the horizontal path, which is much more what you're describing. It's like, hey, this is it now, so let's work on being present, and through that connection to the present, we're more focused, and then we can be more skillful at whatever it is we're doing, whether we're seeking, God realization, or deeper relationships, or more skillfulness in a musical instrument or career, whatever it is. It's really learning to be present in the moment.
Also, when you're in the moment, when you are process oriented, when you're functioning in the present, you have access to your full consciousness, because your mind is not scattered with thoughts of the future or regrets of the past, or all those types of things. All of your thought energy. What happens is that your thinking process, your thought generation, thins out. You have less thoughts. Your mind becomes more focused. You have clarity, and you have much more computational energy, at your fingertips. It's like, to me, it's like shutting down background tasks on the computer. You have access to more RAM, and so it really just makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm a father, and I'm always thinking to myself how much my daughter teaches me, and as well how much a yoga practice being a parent is. And I'm curious to hear from you, because I believe you're a parent of two. Is what has being a parent taught you about focus and presence?
Well, I've learned when I was younger, particularly, I even mentioned it in the Practicing Mind, as I was writing the book, I was learning about the content that I was writing. And I remember one moment when I was having all these ideas about what to write about. And at that time, my daughters are out of college now, but they were very young then. And I was staying at home I was able to, with my job, because of I was self-employed. There were times where I stayed home with the kids during the week, and before they were in school, and I was taking care of them. And I remember they were my responsibility at that time, and my mind was not in the present moment. It was like, I really need to write this stuff down, and I had all these ideas flowing through my head. And when that happened, because the observer was active in me, I realized that I was not experiencing the time with the kids. What I was doing was I was almost looking at them being there as something that was getting in the way of me writing this book. And as soon as I saw that, I let go of the book idea and turned my mind back into whatever it was, making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich or whatever. And I found that I learned so much about being in the present, and they were teaching me that. And also, as you raise kids, our kids today are not taught to be in the present moment. They're taught to be very distracted. And so I find myself constantly working with my daughters to help them understand the value of being process oriented. So once again, then I have to articulate my experience in a way that means something to them. So from both sides, I think, parenting is, it really offers us an opportunity to understand what we have learned, and then how to articulate that to to our children in a way that means something to them. Plus, we're always teaching by our actions, even though we may not be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. And if you could give people one, whether it's a practice or an insight that could help them be more present and focused in their lives, what would that be?
That's a real easy question. It has to be the thought awareness training. Everything that we're talking about here doesn't exist, and you don't have access to it if you're not able to separate yourself from the thinking mind. You just can't do it. You will always be a puppet of the mind. So to me, you have got to learn that you are not your thoughts. You are the one that experiences your thoughts. Some of those thoughts are intentional on your part, but many of them, if not most of them, are just created without your permission. And you can't do that if you don't practice thought awareness. You can't separate yourself, as we said earlier. When you're impatient, there's a difference between being impatient and being in your impatience and behaving impatiently and being aware that you're having this impatient thought. When you're aware that you're having the impatient thought, you've given yourself the privilege of choice. Now, all of a sudden, you can choose to not have the impatient thought and not experience impatience. But if you're not aware of it, you're not separate from it, then you're just a slave to the impatience.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one of the primary things we're talking about, or I talk about a lot in my classes with yoga, is that we're learning to respond instead of react. So the reactions are coming from that subconscious program habitual space, and if you're not aware of it, then you just keep acting from that place of reaction. But the moment you can have awareness of your thoughts, your feelings in the moment, then you're free to respond. You have the choice of, okay, how do I want to interact with this moment in my life? And it's really empowering to have life that way, because it becomes, as Joseph Campbell used to say, instead of a fall, it becomes a dive. Like it's a conscious act of doing something. I mean, life, there's no ground anyways, we're all fallen, so might as well make it a conscious, deliberate thing where we're doing it from that place of intent instead of habit and just reaction.
That's right. And speaking of yoga, I practice yoga too. And I think one of the beauties of yoga is it's really almost like a moving meditation. I guess it is a moving meditation. I mean, you through breath, through focus on the breath in coordination with the movements, I find not only with myself, but I took one of my daughters to the class, and now she's going all the time. But what her comment was that she had a stressful day. And when we finished the yoga class, she said, you know what? I'm like so separate from all those stressful thoughts after this 1 hour class. And I said, yeah, because it's, coordinating the breath with the movements, and it promotes present moment functioning is what it does. It's a really a wonderful thing. I highly recommend it.
And that's, I think, something that to me at least does add a lot of the value and power in the physical asana, the postures that are so common in the West, is that, I'm a huge advocate of meditation, but that can also lead to a disconnect at times from life, versus when we have to be really engaged in the body. You're balancing on one foot, you're balancing on your hands, you're placing your body in a very deliberate way. It's a very embodied experience. It's a very real life experience of like, okay, yes, I'm doing all this strange stuff with my body, but can I also do it while being aware of my breath and present of my thoughts? Because when I'm out in the world, I'm not seated in meditation all day long. I'm moving, I'm relating to things, I'm directing my limbs here, other people are directing things there. And so it becomes much more an invitation into the embodied experience of everything that we're discussing here, or that's being sort of expounded or talked about in yoga, is that like, okay, can we really be present in the world, not just when we're sitting in a cave and there are no distractions, but when we're really interacting with all the difficult and challenging moments of life. And that's true attainment. And to me, that's much more exciting than the idea of, okay, well, let me find realization and focus when I'm not being distracted, or only being distracted by my mind. How about being distracted by your mind and the bills you have to pay and the traffic that you're stuck in and the political climate and everything else? I mean, that's real practice and real challenging.
That's really well put. I think that it is, whether it's meditation, yoga, they're all spiritual skills that are built through repetition. I mean, what is practice? My definition of practice is that it's the repetition of a process whether it's mental or physical. It can be how to take the golf club back on the backswing. It can be how to react in a situation. It can be a yoga move. It's a repetition of a process with the intention to achieve a specific result. And the intention is very important in that, because it implies total consciousness on in what you're trying to accomplish there. So there's a presentness that is there. And I think that what you were just talking about, being able, these practices, they give us the ability to be self-empowered, to be able to be conscious choice makers, to be able to face situations that are difficult without experiencing them as difficult. Because we master our mind, we master the experiences, our interpretation of the experiences, I should say. And that's when you really begin to become self-realized.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a very illuminating talk. I really appreciate your insights, and in particular because it's coming from such an accessible place, and so much of the work that we do on the podcast is to make what are sometimes more lofty and seemingly foreign ideas very accessible and digestible to people. And I think that's something that you do very skillfully in the work that you do. So I appreciate that very much. Where can people find out more about the work that you do? Best place to get your book? I know you've got a website. Maybe you could tell our listeners about how to get in touch with you.
They can find me at tomsterner.com. It's just TOMSTERNER.com. There's links on the books they can see. They're pretty much at all major retailers are available. And they can also send me, contact me. There's a contact thing there. Send me an email. Tell me what you think. I'd love to hear from people. I also do coaching. The fun of the coaching is watching people change. Well, it's like watching people when you're teaching them yoga as they begin to their skills rise, and the things that used to be difficult for them become effortless. But there's also, I have the Practicing Mind Institute. There's link outs to that where we talk about this stuff. It's a community, and there's also a separate site for just the Practicing Mind that people can go read more about that book too.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Tom. I really appreciate the work that you do and your insights and everything that you've shared on the show today. I'm certain that our listeners have gained a lot from hearing you. For all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening and joining us today. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, if you have a spare minute, please go over to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. We really appreciate it. And if you're on Facebook, check out our new Facebook group. It's the same name as our blog, Savannah East. Thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.